Hello and welcome to this DW Business Special. I'm Chris Kober in Berlin. Amid Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, today we'll be talking about the attempts to influence or even stop the attack by economic means. We're talking about sanctions. And joining me for this conversation is Nicholas Mulder, Assistant Professor of Modern European History at Cornell University and author of the book The Economic Weapon: The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. Welcome to DW, Nicholas. Let's dive right in here. What are the economic sanctions against Russia supposed to achieve?
Yes, thank you for having me on, Chris. So the sanctions against Russia have a few goals, but the most important one of them is to make the Russian continuation of its aggressive war against Ukraine as difficult as possible and to raise the costs of Russian aggression. At the beginning of the war, when we weren't yet sure exactly how long this would go on for, I think some people also hoped that potentially the sanctions would help push Russia closer to negotiating. I think that possibility is at the moment far away. So the main goal is to weaken Russia's capacity to continue the war.
So the big question revolving around the issue of sanctions is their effectiveness. Now, Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, published a paper recently. The headline reading, "Yes, sanctions against Russia are working." And he gave a few examples. He said, because of the $60 oil price cap introduced by the West, Russian oil revenue fell 27% from a year before. Over 1,000 foreign companies have exited or suspended operations in Russia, including car manufacturers. Therefore, car production in Russia was down almost 50% in 2022 compared to the year before. And last but not least, Josep Borrell also stated that Russian assets worth 300 billion euros have been frozen in the EU and other countries. Money that may otherwise have been used and that could be used to rebuild Ukraine one day. Nicholas, back to you. Do you agree with Josep Borrell? Have sanctions been working?
Well, sanctions are definitely a nuisance for Russia. They would much rather not be under sanctions than be under sanctions. But that being said, I think that they are not as successful as we hoped they would be. Certainly, a lot of those figures are indisputable, particularly about car production. But we have to place that in the wider context of Russia's continued ability to keep attacking Ukraine almost every week with major missile barrages. One of the big hopes, for example, was that cutting off Russian access to semiconductor technology from the West would impair their ability to manufacture precision-guided weapons. Russian missile production is now higher than it was before the war. Russia is producing about 7 times as much artillery ammunition as the EU and the United States combined. So they have managed to adapt their economy and they have prioritized the war effort. So it's certainly true that the civilian car industry, for example, has suffered, but this is the sort of thing that you would see in an economy that is geared increasingly towards war. Civilian industries are being deprived of resources, and those resources are being funneled into military production.
But nevertheless, tell us why these sanctions that the West came up with are not working in a manner as the West would have hoped for. Is it just because Russia altered its economy?
Well, the Russian response is part of the answer, but the other part is that the sanctions are inherently limited in their scope, not just the number of industries and sectors within Russia that are being targeted, Russian fertilizer, Russian metals, and a number of other sectors, food exports, grain also are not under sanctions. It's also that they're not actually being joined by all countries in the world. So there are many countries, particularly, of course, major Asian economies, India and China most notably, but even NATO members like Turkey that are not part of this sanctions effort. The Middle East, the Gulf states, Latin American and African nations continue to trade at sizable levels with Russia. All of that means that the West is only part of the overall economic impact of this sanctions offensive against Russia, and they've managed to divert a lot of this trade.
So obviously, the more parties join the effort, the higher the effectiveness of these sanctions. I think we can state that. But if we look at the mechanism, what sort of prerequisites do there need to be in order for sanctions to work?
Yes, the most successful sanctions tend to be those that go hand in hand with some kind of political negotiation. I think the achievement of the nuclear deal with Iran in 2015 by the Obama administration is always a good example. There was a concrete goal, it was achievable, namely Iranian acceptance of limits on its nuclear weapons program, and in return, the lifting of sanctions. And there was goodwill, preparedness to talk on both sides. That's obviously not the situation we're in right now. We're using sanctions much more as a weapon of economic attrition. The other thing that can really work is to have as large as possible an international coalition participate in the sanctions. And that's, I think, why it will be important to the future of this effort to see whether non-Western nations are increasingly going to join and will, for example, help the West enforce some restrictions, or if they are going to abstain from participation and allow Russia to keep rerouting a lot of its trade.
So if we take the Iran nuclear deal as an example here, is the reluctance of the West, namely President Biden of the United States, for example, their reluctance to define a goal or how victory for Ukraine might look like, is that hampering the impact of these sanctions because they can't be coupled with a goal that the West is working towards?
Well, they are technically coupled. At least this is what the European Union defends, and I think this is the most formally defensible goal, to Russian withdrawal, at the very minimum to the lines before the invasion, but obviously, ideally, to the pre-2014 internationally legally accepted borders of Ukraine. They could still be tied to that. You could imagine potentially in a future where political attitudes on both sides of this conflict have changed, that you could have a kind of tit-for-tat negotiation where ultimately Russian withdrawal is tied to sanctions lifting. But we're not in that situation at the moment.
Now, according to Russian leader Vladimir Putin, Western sanctions aren't working. They're not impacting Russia. He said so this week. Instead, the weak ruble and high inflation would be the bigger problems for the Russian economy, Mr. Putin claimed. Here's more of what he said.
Back in April, GDP growth for the current year was expected at 1.2%. Initially, they actually predicted some minus result for us, but then the forecast was corrected. 1.2% was expected. But in fact, we've already exceeded this bar. By the end of the year, GDP growth may reach the level of 2.5%, perhaps even more, 2.8%. In general, we can say that the stage of recovery of the Russian economy has been completed.
Nicholas, is Mr. Putin deliberately ignoring or downplaying the impact of sanctions?
He's certainly not giving them credit for some of the problems that they are causing. But I think that if you focus on GDP growth, you can tell an optimistic story for Russia, or at least a less pessimistic story. There are really serious problems for the Russian economy. I think particularly as the war effort goes on, a manpower shortage and the impact on the labor force, particularly the highly skilled labor force, is going to be significant. What I do think is the case is that Russia has managed to successfully convert its economy to not trading with the West anymore, and government spending on the war has taken up a growing share of output, and it's compensated for some of the losses that the Russian economy suffered last year. So I definitely think that there will be Russian growth this year. I think we should be prepared for that. It's not a sign that Russia is without problems, but it is a sign the sanctions are working less well than we hoped.
We can talk about where this growth for Russia is coming from here in a moment. First, though, if we talk about the impact that sanctions are supposed to have, so slowing Russian GDP growth, slimming Putin's war chest, those have been the primary objectives. But how much is making the general public feel the pinch part of this plan?
Well, that certainly could be one of the aims. I haven't really seen that articulated openly by many Western leaders. It in the past was, for example, an aim, at least in the sanctions used against Iran. US policymakers did acknowledge that. But the key thing is that in an authoritarian country, there are fewer feedback mechanisms to translate that popular discontent into political change. And that sort of strategy of increasing the harm, or at least the perceived pinch on civilians only really works if there's an opposition that could gain in power or an alternative source of political leadership that could benefit from that. So ultimately, it's a hostage to the political situation inside Russia.
Right, and indeed we haven't seen any public discontent there in Russia on display. Now, the International Monetary Fund is forecasting Russian GDP growth to come in at around 1.5% this year. As we heard, Mr. Putin is expecting far more. But nevertheless, 1.5% would be twice as high as growth in the Eurozone. Where is this growth for the Russian economy coming from? Is it just energy exports to China and India?
Energy exports and the recovery are a large part of it. This is one of the more dramatic trade diversions that we've seen in history made by an economy of this size. But it's also, like I said, the military spending. At the moment, it seems the Russian government officially claims it's spending about 4.5% of GDP on the military. In reality, if you add a lot of expenditures that are in different parts of the budget, but that are actually going to the war effort, it may be 6 or 7%. That's a large stimulus. So increased government spending is a way that you can boost growth. And the only limit on that is obviously fiscal and debt. And at the moment, Russia is running about a 2% a year budget deficit. They have very low government debt to GDP, so they could sustain that for quite a while. And they're also working on increasing their tax income in order to keep that going in the long run.
Now, despite these sanctions being intact, Russian oil is still making it into Western countries thanks to intermediaries like India. Russian oil, for instance, is shipped from Murmansk via the Northern Sea route to the Pacific and Indian Ocean to Indian ports like Jamnagar. After that, it is piped to nearby refineries. In the first 7 months of the year, India shipped more refined oil to the rest of the world, including Germany, where exports totaled 451 million euros. That's a 12-fold increase compared to the same period last year, when it only shipped refined oil worth 37 million euros to Europe's largest economy. Nicholas, back to you. Is this basically the Achilles heel of sanctions in a globalized world, that there's always a good chance someone will, in the end, not participate and offer a lifeline to the sanctioned country?
Yes, it is a weakness, and it's particularly a weakness given the size of Asian economies in global GDP. When Western nations began to use economic sanctions as a tool for enforcing rules in the early 20th century, in the interwar period, and then also under the United Nations after World War II, the United States and Europe were very large economic blocs. They had the vast majority of global trade. But now in the second, third decade already of the 21st century, actually, could I just rephrase that? But now in the third decade already of the 21st century, we're in a world economy where Asia constitutes a very large share. 3/4 of global GDP growth this year is going to be located in Asia. So in that sense, Russia has actually hitched a lot of its trade to a faster growing part of the world economy than it had before. And I think that means that it's an Asian affair now. It also means that we need to put far more diplomatic resources, I think, into convincing the Asian countries that they do have an interest in helping bring this conflict to an end.
And we have to, of course, keep in mind that Russia is selling its energy to a lower price to places like China and India. But Nicholas, as you mentioned, I mean, the more Asia is gaining in importance for the world economy, the less likely these Western sanctions are going to have an impact, are they?
Yes, well, there are Asian countries that are participating. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore are part of the technology embargo. They've also frozen Russian bank assets. But even without them, India, China, Turkey, and the Emirates together are also capable of compensating for quite a lot of that. So it is, I think, in Asia that we have to look for a potential solution. It also means that we need to take other demands and interests of these countries into account. So this requires a kind of diplomatic change of attitude.
Now, for a bit of global perspective, Russia is the world's most sanctioned country. By the end of last year, there were more than 12,000 active sanctions against individuals and organizations in place. Russia was followed by Iran, with around 3,700 sanctions. Then came Syria and North Korea, Belarus with fifth with just over 1,000, and Venezuela and Myanmar with several hundred, round up the top 7. Nicholas, back to you. Now, in the case of Russia, sanctions are to have an economic impact, of course, as we said, trying to slim Putin's war chest. But what if human lives are immediately on the line, are immediately linked to economic efforts, like in Afghanistan, for example, an economy almost entirely based on foreign aid, which has largely been frozen since the Taliban took over? Is implementing sanctions on these kind of countries, is that still the right way to exert pressure?
Well, in the case of Afghanistan, the big problem is that a part of their foreign exchange reserves, their central bank reserves, have been frozen. And there is now a plan to have them gradually unfrozen under international oversight. So after, I think, the international outcry about the humanitarian effects of those sanctions, a solution was found. But it is true that for a country like Afghanistan that has way fewer links to the rest of the world, losing even a few $1 billion of reserves can have a very dramatic impact.
Now, you've studied the impact and the effect of sanctions to quite a large extent. What are the limits of economic sanctions?
I think the limits are the things that we've been talking about so far, that they work best when you set feasible goals that can actually be attained. You cannot ask another country to disband itself, to totally change its own government, or to give up a goal that they consider to be a vital national interest. But you can achieve goals that are less than that. The other thing is that the limits of sanctions are importantly determined by how governments view the world and why they undertake policy in the first place. Sometimes governments are willing to take decisions, even if there is a large economic cost attached to them. In fact, entire electorates are willing to take decisions that are not in their economic self-interest. I mean, I just give you the example of Brexit, where a major European country voted democratically to do something that is clearly not in its commercial interest. And yet, right, I think to that degree, sanctions sometimes see the world as being driven a lot by the maximization of economic gain, but that is not the world that we live in. People, a lot of the time, have that as their motivation, but not always. So we need to understand political and cultural and ideological ways of acting as well.
Nicholas, let's, for a final question, let's circle back here to Russia. Do you believe that the maximum in sanctions trying to be implemented by the West against Russia is reached, or can there be more economic pressure exerted by the West?
There can be more pressure that we could put on. Sorry, I'll just rephrase that. We could certainly put more pressure on Russia. The limits to that aren't technical, in the sense that the West does have the levers, both economic but also particularly legal, through control over courts, over the dollar, the euro, the yen, these important currencies. We could tighten these restrictions further. The real limits to them are political, and they go back to what I was talking about before, the fact that we would alienate a large part of the rest of the world if we were to really bring down the hammer on, say, Brazil or South Africa or India, and their ability to trade with Russia. So I think that we should look for potential towards a diplomatic overture towards these countries. The other thing that could work is to propose a treaty where we say that we can exempt internationally certain categories of goods from sanctions pressure: food, essential forms of medicine, and, for example, technologies that are only used by civilians, such as civilian aviation, parts, and maintenance. Those are things that don't really add to the military or strategic value of sanctions. But if we have an international treaty that would exempt those from ever having sanctions placed on them, we could potentially bring a large part of the global south on board, because we take away an often heard argument there now, which is that we are raising the prices of their food, raising the prices of their energy, and therefore imposing a big cost on their population. So we could potentially reach a new kind of global agreement on that, I think.
Well, let's see if the political will is there inside and outside the Kremlin, but it doesn't go without diplomacy, that's for sure. Nicholas Mulder, thank you very much for your time and your analysis. Nicholas is an assistant professor of modern European history at Cornell University and author of the book The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. And thanks to you. Be sure to tell us what you think in the comments section and check out more of our stuff in the business section of the DW News YouTube channel. I'm Chris Colbert in Berlin. Take care and see you soon.